So welcome again to everyone. We are in our fourth class in the Jewish literacy series. The first three were what is often called a taste of Judaism, which was a broad overview. And as you probably have learned by now, I know how to email. So I'm sending out emails typically on Sunday or maybe Monday, and then a day or two before this class. And then I also send out the evening of the class, or maybe tomorrow morning, an email with the recording. So you should have access to that. We are now beginning sort of the intensive work, and I strongly recommend that you get the books for the class. And I don't think I have them again, but they, if you have a question. One is my book called A Christian's Guide to Judaism, and the other one is called The Complete, can't quite see it. Whoops, sorry. It's The Complete How-To Handbook for Jewish Living. And for those of you that are interested in conversion, I would say those are mandatory.
Got them already.
Okay, good. And what? Okay, so I'm glad that that to have you here. I'm gonna let one more person in. I'm gonna start my screen share. But as I start the screen share, Cheryl, look okay? Yep, okay, good. As I start the screen share, I'll also ask, does anyone have any questions before we dive into tonight's subject? Anything going on? Okay, as you know, we are a small enough group so that you can raise questions either by raising your hands. I can actually see everybody who has their camera on, or you can raise your electronic hand. So, fourth session, the Hebrew calendar, holidays, and Shabbat. Once again, my services are made available by the Jewish Federation and the Affordable Living Choices Trust. And once again, if you go to my website, you will find, you click on classes, you click on this topic for the materials for the Jewish literacy class. And then for each class I will have occasionally some additional materials, but I'll always have the recording for the class. So we are talking about the Hebrew calendar. And the Hebrew calendar is more than just a calendar. The Hebrew calendar is really underlines a philosophy of what Judaism is about. Judaism is about more than simply, a bunch of holidays strung together. I would say the Jewish calendar is more than just a bunch of Jewish holidays strung together. I'm just going to mute everyone to leave out extraneous noise. But there is a pattern and a path, and I hope to give you a little bit of insight into that. And I should have grabbed this book down, but there is a wonderful book called The Jewish Way by Rabbi Irving Greenberg. And it is a book about deep spiritual insights into the calendar as a whole, and also the structure of the calendar and the Jewish holidays themselves. And it's in my recommended reading list. But the point, of course, of all of this is that Judaism is simply more about what you believe. I've said it so many times. I often wonder if people are going to start throwing things at me, and I feel very safe here behind the screen, that Judaism is much more about what we live, what we do in our lives, than what we believe. And so the calendar defines how you live your life, and structure of holidays and holy, and specifically, of course, meaning holy days. Just admitting more people. The central paradigm of Judaism is redemption. So the central thought going on in Judaism is the idea that at some point in time, everything was perfect or almost perfect. And then people screwed up. And then God, or I would actually amend that. What I would say is God deliberately decided to create an imperfect world and turns over to God's partners, namely us, the job of making the world a better place. And that idea is redemption or teshuvah. It's the word teshuvah, which is often translated as atonement or redemption, means turning. So it's changing your life and turning your life around. And I would say turning the universe around. In the Hebrew calendar, in these classes, there's going to be philosophy that we can talk and compare notes about and argue about, but there's also simply going to be a lot of information I need to give you. So the information is the days begin at sunset. So you probably know this. Those of you that certainly are connected with Judaism know this, that the Sabbath begins Friday night at sunset and ends Saturday night at sunset. Why? Because in the opening of the Bible, as it describes the creation of the universe, at the end of every day, it says, Yehi erev v'yehi voker yom echad. It was evening and it was morning, a first day. It doesn't say it was morning and it was evening. So since it says evening first, the days begin at sunset. The months are listed here. Many of the months are really named after Babylonian gods. Some of them are actually mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And one unique and interesting thing about the Hebrew Bible is that it has a date of origin, a year zero, which is tied to a universal event, namely creation, rather than an important event in our religion or our culture. The most obvious comparison would be the Gregorian calendar, the one we use all the time, where it's 2021, and of course year zero on that is tied to the birth of Jesus. Of course, there's really some question about when actually was the birth of Jesus, but at least that's the point. And as you probably know, the words BC mean before Christ, and AD mean not after death, which I find a significant fraction of people think that means, but AD is Anno Domini, Latin for Year of Our Lord. Since Jews don't recognize Jesus as the Christ or Lord, we use the initials BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. The Muslim calendar, you may not know, is actually dated to the date of Muhammad's pilgrimage from one city to another. Barbara, I thought I saw you waving. Maybe you were. Barbara Gerson. No, you're muted.
What does common era mean? What is common?
Common era, an era when Judaism and Christianity were in common. I mean, they both existed.
So BCE would be
before the Common Era, before the era when Judaism, Christianity existed side by side.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Good question. And increasingly, that's used by scholars writing about dates. And of course, those dates are exactly the same as the Gregorian calendar. Okay, let me move on. So the Hebrew calendar is both lunar and solar. This makes it quite novel and quite interesting. I don't know if there are any other calendars that do both. So there are 12 months in the Hebrew calendar. And because they are tied to the phases of the moon, each new moon, the first crescent of the moon, begins a new month. Because the months are tied to the new moon, if you have 12 cycles of new moons, you are 11 days short, roughly speaking, of a solar year. Does everybody understand the words that I've just said? It's a little bizarre. And of course, in our calendar, which is a solar calendar, we're tied to our position and our orbit around the sun, which is 365.25 days. So what we do in our Gregorian calendar is every 4 years, we add a February 29th leap year. In the Hebrew calendar, we add leap months. Now, why do we add a leap month? The reason we add a leap month is because the Torah says that Nisan occurs in the spring. So we have to keep Nisan in the spring. if we didn't add any leap months, every Pesach would be 11 days earlier in the Gregorian calendar. So 7 times, in a 19-year cycle, we add the extra month of Adar, and it's called Adar Sheni or Adar 2. And it's in these years of the 19-year cycle. And I'm sure you're all dying to know how to tell whether any given year is going to be a leap year. In fact, in Hebrew, it's called a Shana Merubah, literally a pregnant year. And the answer is, does anybody remember long division where you had remainders? So you divide the year, this year is 5782, by 19, and you get 304 remainder 6. And so since remainder 6 is one of these years, this year we get a leap month of Adar. So you probably know, we'll see in a moment, that the dates of the holidays will shift dramatically. By the way, I should point out, just because it's a fun thing to point out, that Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year, is actually not the anniversary of creation, but the anniversary of the 6th day of creation, the creation of humanity. So that's day 0 in our calendar. And how do they come up with the fact that this is year 5782? Well, you do a lot of homework in all of the genealogies in the Bible. And I can tell you without a trace of shame, I have never checked the math. And I am told that it is not, it's not precise, that there's enough ambiguity in how long someone lived and when they were born, that it's not 100% clear that this really is, even by that standard, year 5782. But at some point in time, and I actually don't even know when they fixed the year. The first day of each month is Rosh Chodesh, which literally means the head of the moon, or the recycling of the lunar month, and that's a minor holiday. You're allowed to work on it. You actually read Torah in the synagogue on Rosh Chodesh, and there's different liturgical inserts, and it's come to have a particular significance for women, because women's cycles are also governed on a monthly basis. So we have 54 Torah portions, because if you have a month if you have a year that contains a leap month, you're going to have more Shabbatot in that year than normal. So you have to have separate Torah portions. So in regular years, we have double Torah portions. And sometimes you'll see that occasionally people will ask me about it. So this is the reason why the holidays seem to come earlier and later. When people ask me a question like, when is Hanukkah this year? My flip answer is, same as every year, it's the 25th of Kislev. It's not Hanukkah that comes early and later, it's Christmas that comes earlier and later, according to the Hebrew calendar. So just to illustrate it, actually, before I illustrate it, I'll ask Les.
Are you saying that there's 11 months in the Jewish calendar,
No.
or is there 12?
There's 12 months, and in the leap year, there are 13 months.
No, okay, but when you had the months up there was only 11.
Then I have a typo in it.
That's what I was trying to figure out. There's only 11 months.
Yeah, thank you for counting. You're the first one to notice that, and hopefully I will remember it. Cheryl.
Can you explain why the 1st of Tishrei is the 7th month, but it's Rosh Hashanah?
Yes. Oh, you actually want me to explain it? I just thought that was a interrogatory of my knowledge base. Yes.
Please explain.
Yes, I don't recall. I don't think I have that in this presentation. In the Talmud, there are 4 different New Years identified. There's the New Year for years, which is the first day of Tishrei, and you're correct in pointing out that Tishrei is the 7th month, not the 1st month. The 1st month is Nisan. So there's a New Year, which I think is the 1st of Nisan. There's the year for counting, there's the new year for counting years, which is Tishrei. There is a new year for trees. Anybody know what the new year for trees is?
Tisha B'Av.
No, but you're
But
close.
Tu B'Shvat.
Right, Tu B'Shvat. The 15th day of the month of Shvat is the new year for trees. And I think there's a new year for tithing in the tithing cycle, which was very important during temple times. So all that's laid out in the Mishnah. So that's Talmudic. So getting back to this year, Rosh Hashanah was on September 7th. This is actually the day. So Erev Rosh Hashanah, the evening of Rosh Hashanah, was on the 6th, and I'm at least consistent there. Yom Kippur, the 16th, and Hanukkah begins on November 28th. Next year, because we have a leap year, instead of September 7th, it's going to be September 26th, Rosh Hashanah, and all the other days are also going to be, significantly later. The following year, if you look 26th to 16th, it's 10 days earlier. And by the way, the Muslim calendar doesn't make this adjustment. For those of you who are interested in this, Muslim calendar is also a lunar calendar, and there is no adjustment. So if you're aware of Muslim holidays like Ramadan, which is a month-long holiday, you may notice that it occurs 11 days, roughly 10 or 11 days earlier every year. And so it can be in the winter, it can be in the summer, but not the Jewish holidays. And by the way, if you're counting years in the Muslim calendar and you want to compare that to the length of time in years as we use it, you also have to make an adjustment. So the other interesting element of the Jewish calendar with which you are no doubt aware is the idea of the double days. The fact that we have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, we have 2 days of Passover, so there are 2 Passover Seders, and Sukkot also will have a double day. So what's going on with the double days of the holidays? Here is what's going on. In ancient times, in temple times, the way you knew a month began was in Jerusalem, or I don't know what they did in cloudy days, but in Jerusalem, someone would cite the fact that the new moon appeared in the sky. And then they would send the word out around Israel, around the Holy Land, that the first day of, let's say, Cheshvan occurred this day, and we can start counting. And almost every Jewish holiday is in the middle of the month. Most Jewish holidays occur in a full moon, not a new moon. So you have 2 weeks to get the word out. Israel's a pretty small country, about the size of New Jersey, not a problem. Once you had a diaspora and you had Jewish communities in Babylon and Jewish communities in Egypt, it's now a much greater distance to get the word of the official sighting of the new moon in Jerusalem to the community in time to celebrate the holidays on the correct day. So what they would do would be, they would calculate what the day would be, and then they would also celebrate it for an extra day. So let's just take Passover. Most of you know, in traditional Judaism, we have 2 Passover Seders because we have 2 days of first days of Passover when you have a Seder. That is only outside of Israel. So inside Israel today, Passover is a 7-day holiday, and you only have 1 Seder. But let me just finish one more thought, and then I'll call on you, Bryce. In Israel, even in Israel, you have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Why do you have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Because Rosh Hashanah is a holiday, and you're not allowed to light bonfires. One of the ways they would communicate that it was a new moon was they would light bonfires or send people running around to spread the word. Once you sight the new moon of Tishrei, it's a holy day, and you can't do any of that stuff. So even in Israel, you celebrate Rosh Hashanah for 2 days. This is Jewish tradition. In the Reform movement, we have realized, hey, we actually know with pretty good precision when there will be a new moon in Jerusalem. And so the Reform movement has officially done away with the second day of holidays, but many Reform congregations will still celebrate a second day of a holiday. And many Reform Jews will have two Passover Seders because you need one for one side of the family, one for the other side of the family, or a community Seder and a family Seder. Bryce.
Yeah, would you consider it a substantial piece of evidence that the chaos in the construction of the periodicity of the solar system, you know, how all of the things go around and how nothing fits and nothing is even? Would you consider that to be an excellent or a good piece of evidence that the solar system had evolved instead of being created in such a chaotic way by a being with such a perfect mind?
No.
Okay.
No, it's our numbering system. How do we decide the numbers? How do we measure seconds?
Oh, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that the moon has no regularity when considered with the orbit of the sun, orbit of the Earth
Yes,
around the sun,
yes.
and it's completely
Yes.
chaotic. Nothing fits.
Yes.
If it were
Okay,
designed as a clock.
So
Yeah.
yes, so I absolutely agree with your mathematics, but I would not draw theological conclusions about that. And that's really my answer. I do draw theological conclusions from science and physics, as you well know. But I would say that is not that's not one I would use, and I wouldn't consider that existence to negate it. But it's a good question, and I never thought about it. So I thank you for giving it to me to think about it. Jane.
I know even in Reform, there the first two nights of Pesach, you have Seders. Is it in the conservative or Orthodox at the last two nights?
Okay,
are
so
Seders?
so you said even in Reform, I would say the official position of the Reform is you don't have two Seders, but many Reform Jews do.
Okay,
Okay. The last day of Passover is also a holiday.
right.
So now the question is, when is the last day? So if you're celebrating the second day of the holiday, then day number 7 is the last day and day number 8 is the last day.
But I know some people have Seders then too.
I don't know that there's any Jewish justification for Seders at the end of Passover.
Okay,
I know people do it. I know people have chocolate Seders. I know people have women's Seders. There is actually a really interesting tradition of observing the end of Passover. This is only in North Africa, mainly in Morocco, with something called Mamuna, which is a wonderful celebration I've been introduced to by my wife. And I believe the tradition, as she described it to me, was that in the Arabs in the community would bake things. They would be kosher, but not kosher for Passover. And so they would bring treats and things into Jewish homes so that we could, it's like breaking the Passover fast. You know, it's like when you have that first, I don't know what you have, when it passes over, your first bagel, your first pizza. So, but that's only North Africa. I'm not aware of any other official celebration of the end of Passover. Les.
I'm a little confused. When Bryce was talking about chaos and you sort of agreed with him, my understanding is we go around the sun 365 and a quarter days a year. If we were so chaotic and off course and everything, we'd have blown off and gone. I mean,
No, that's
So
not
I'm
what
not
Bryce is saying.
understanding.
Hold on.
Oh, okay.
Here's my interpretation of what Bryce is saying. Is if the universe was more finely tuned, for one thing, we wouldn't have that quarter day. It seems the solar orbit seems not to be tied to anything we can identify also in nature. Is that kind of what you were saying, Bryce?
Yes,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that if you were going to put something in the sky so that we could look up and see that the universe was regular and orderly, then the moon would go around a certain number of times that would evenly divide into the solar orbit and would say,
Yeah.
look, it would
Yes.
have to have been
Yeah.
made by God.
Yes. So there I would say that would be a sweet thing, but it would be a temporary thing because, as you know, the moon's orbit degrades. The fact that there are tides affects the moon's orbit, and I'm sure there are other things that I'm not aware of that affects the orbit of the moon. So to have an absolutely consistent universe that would exist for all time would violate the laws of physics.
Well, it's God's universe. He could do what he wants.
But he can't violate the laws of physics in my understanding. I think he sets the laws of physics, but then doesn't violate them. This is a snippet of a much longer discussion. Okay, so if you want to know what a Hebrew calendar looks like, this is what a Hebrew calendar looks like. This one is from Chabad. Back in the good old days when we all went to synagogues, typically synagogues would have copies of calendars sometime around Rosh Hashanah, and they would hand them out. And so I don't know how many, I'm just curious, how many of you just by hands actually have a Jewish calendar in your hot little hands? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Of course, these days you can get anything online. So I didn't update this. This is, as of looks like a year ago. Because
Last year's.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, last year's, I see.
Yeah, it's last year. Because really, I just want to illustrate what a Hebrew calendar looks like and what you will see on a Hebrew calendar. And I know that, this may be, depending on your screen size, this may be very small. So typically they will be organized, unless you go to Israel, by, Gregorian months. So this page is September. And September 1st, last year was the 13th day of Elul. In this particular website I went to, if you're doing daily Torah study, actually, I don't know what this is from. I think this is a Chabad calendar. Now I don't remember. But when you get to Friday, if the calendar is printed for your area, it will have a candle lighting time. You're supposed to light the candles. We may talk about this when we get to Shabbat. And I probably ought to pick up my speed a little bit. You're supposed to light candles 18 minutes before local sunset. And this is really important. If you go to Israel, they will have a different candle lighting time for each city in Israel. Remember, Israel's pretty small. And they will set off a siren when it's time to light candles. And then on Shabbat, you see over here, or you may not be able to see, a Jewish calendar will often have the Torah portion for that week. And you'll see the ending time. And if you notice, the candle lighting time here is 6:58 p.m. The ending time is 7:54 p.m. It's actually roughly 25 hours because you light Shabbat candles 18 minutes before local sunset, and you light Haddalah candles, you declare the Sabbath over when you see 3 stars in the sky. So in practice, that's about an hour or so after sunset. When you have Jewish holidays, so I'll just pick up the big ones here. So here's this little one here is the first day of Tishrei. So the night before, it's Erev Rosh Hashanah, and they'll have a candle lighting time. And then the Shabbat is Rosh Hashanah, the first day, and they will have a candle lighting time just after the end of the Sabbath, because once the Sabbath ends, then you can light holiday candles for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So here it says Rosh Hashanah 2, and the date that the holiday ends. And then there will also be minor holidays that you never heard of. This one is Tzom Gedalia. There's the fast of Gedalia. And that's pretty much what I wanted to show you here. So Barbara, you have a question and you need to unmute. When I gave a talk live yesterday, 150 people at a church, I didn't use the word unmute. It was such a relief. Yes,
Sorry
Barbara.
about that. Yeah, I had a question about what you said about Haddalah.
Mhm.
So if it's cloudy, how do you know when to light the candle?
You look at this. You
Oh,
look
it
at
says
the calendar.
Oh,
Isn't
okay,
that lucky?
okay.
And by the way, I want to point out, without going on, the calendar does a bunch of other things that you wouldn't dream are necessary. For example, Yom Kippur can never be on a Sunday. Why can't Yom Kippur be on a Sunday? Because, when we had shared a church for, they would have Sunday service, we would have Yom Kippur service. No, Yom Kippur can't be on a Sunday because you're not allowed to cook on Saturday, right? Because it's Shabbat. If Yom Kippur were on a Sunday, you wouldn't be allowed to cook on Sunday. And when it came time to break the fast, you would get food poisoning. So the calendar is structured more delicately than what I just pointed out. Some months could either be 29 or 30 days, and they choose which ones to balance that. And there's about 3 or 4 other things that the Jewish calendar has to accomplish. And Hillel did this 2,000 years ago. Cheryl.
What do you do when, like, you have Shabbat on Friday night, and let's say Yom Kippur Erev starts on Friday night? Which candles do you light first?
I think, I don't know if Yom Kippur ever starts on a Friday night, but generally speaking, when you have Shabbat and another holiday for which you light candles, okay? Here's the rule. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to start a fire, right? Nor are you allowed to transfer fire. What do I mean by transfer fire? If I light a candle Friday afternoon, a long candle, and then Friday night after Shabbat starts, I just take that candle and transfer the flame to my Shabbat candles, I violated Jewish law. But other Jewish holidays, like Passover and so on, you're not allowed to start a fire, but you're allowed to transfer fire. So I think that's what you do. So you would light the Shabbat candles first, or like on Hanukkah, what you do is you light Hanukkah candles first, before sunset on Friday, and then you light the Shabbat candles. Because once you light the Shabbat candles, you can't light Hanukkah candles, and you're allowed to light Hanukkah candles before sunset. Okay, and the details of that, ask your Chabad rabbi. He will be far more familiar with those rules than I. So here's just a December, and what you'll see often, in addition to the features that I just showed you, they will also tell you Hanukkah 1 candle, even though here, this is the first day of Hanukkah, the 25th day of Kislev, we light candles the night before. So in many Jewish calendars, you will see the night before, it will tell you to light 1 candle, and it'll help you keep track of the candles. There's a fast day. Oh, the 11th of, I think Tevet, yes, is a fast day. So the issue is, when does the fast, the 10th, I'm sorry, Asara B'Tevet, when does the fast begin? When does the fast end? Because you can't fast on the Sabbath. So there's a lot of Jewish law going on in this. And again, here are the cycles. And sure enough, there are 12 months, and I'll go back and check that thing. I appreciate your pointing it out. And I just want to point out something. Here's Passover in the middle of Nisan. Sukkot is exactly to the day 6 months later. Passover celebrates the moment of liberation. Sukkot celebrates the process of liberation, namely the 40 years of living in small huts. So there's stuff going on there throughout the calendar. And I'll mention some of these things as we talk about the individual calendars. So I think I have a separate class discussing some of these most important holidays in more detail, but clearly the major holidays, the high holidays, are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. By the way, there's only 1 day of Yom Kippur. Can anybody guess why?
Because of fasting.
Yeah, you can't fast for 2 days. So they don't extend this uncertainty about Yom Kippur, and I guess by Yom Kippur the word would get out, but not in the diaspora. I worked for an Israeli, and he told the story of being in Japan for Rosh Hashanah, and he was flying back, I think, to the States around Yom Kippur, and he had the problem of going across the date line. So he would have 2 days of Yom Kippur. He himself was not particularly observant, but he did fast on Yom Kippur. So he didn't know what to do. So he asked his rabbi, and they went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, the rabbi told him, stay in Japan another day. We can't figure this out. And of course, we have this myth, and we'll talk about this idea of the book of life. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, on Yom Kippur it is sealed. We'll talk a lot more about that, I think, in the next class. I have a little bit more here. So again, as you mentioned, Cheryl, it's the seventh. It's the first day of the 7th month. It is not mentioned in the Bible as New Year's at all. In the Bible, it says it's a sacred convocation. It's a holy day. Don't do any work. It's a day of sounding the shofar. And clearly a time for introspection. The high holidays, I talk about this a lot and did in Texas this year, as both Larry and Bob can testify. I talked about this idea of being on trial for your life on the 10 days, and that's why they are called the 10 days of awe. They are awesome and awe-filled. And the fast is a way of tasting death. The focus is on confession of sin and teshuvah, and the idea that someone who has sinned and repented is actually in a higher spiritual place than someone who has not sinned. Mainly because there is no one who has not sinned. And the tradition in the Talmud is where a Baal Teshuvah stands, at tzaddik cannot. And in this section in the Talmud, they're actually talking about your physical place in heaven. Location. The Baal Teshuvah gets a better spot than someone who has not sinned. Someone who's not sinned may be someone who died very young. And the solemnity of the high holidays actually begins, I'm trying to find my place here, in the beginning of Elul. Actually, so here's trumpets. Why they call it trumpets, I have no idea. This is the first day of Tishrei, Yom Kippur. This is atonement. Maybe this is, it can't just be biblical. So the days of starting to focus on what you've done wrong in the Hebrew calendar begins on Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of the month of Av. And you're supposed to just sort of sit with your problems and do a self-examination during this period and during the month of Elul. And there are prayers for repentance in the month of Elul. So everything fits together. Immediately after Yom Kippur, 4 days after Yom Kippur, comes the happy holiday of Sukkot. And again, I think we're going to talk about this either next time or the time after. We dwell in a little sukkah, and there's a ritual of bringing together 4 different species of plants and shaking them. And I will talk more in detail about those different species when we focus on Sukkot. Joyful holiday immediately following the high holidays, living in booths, commemorating the 40 years of wandering. And in the Bible, they don't talk about the 40 years of wandering. In the Bible, most of the holidays are tied to agriculture rather than history. So in the Bible, they talk about the need to dwell in huts. Why do you need to dwell in huts? Because in the harvest, you have to go out to the fields. Well, you're not going out in station wagons and to the fields. The fields are not necessarily close to where you're living. So they would erect portable shelters in the fields where you would live during harvest, and Sukkot is at harvest time. The commentary on this is the booths are a reminder of the fragility of life itself. The biblical reading on Sukkot is the book of Ecclesiastes, or in Hebrew, Kohelet, which is a very powerful and troubling book. They say that I think King David wrote the Song of Songs in his youth, which is the Song of Songs is very sexual.
Isn't that by Solomon? Didn't
Yeah,
Solomon
now I'm
write
getting
that?
confused. I'm getting
Yeah.
confused. No, David wrote the Psalms. Yes, you're right. The
Right.
Psalms in his youth, and Ecclesiastes in his old age. Yes, you're right. Or maybe this is all about Solomon. Actually, I'm confused. I apologize. I think it's all about Solomon. Solomon wrote Song of Songs in his youth, and Kohelet in his old age.
And he also wrote Proverbs.
Yeah, and so Proverbs in middle age. Thank you. And on the last day of Sukkot, we start praying for rain. And again, this is tying the calendar to what's going on in the world. In Israel and Southern California, it does not rain during the dry season. That's why it's called the dry season. You can pray till you're blue in the face for rain. It's not going to work. The liturgy actually shifts on the last day of Sukkot, and we start praying for rain. Why the last day of Sukkot? We don't want it to rain on us while we're sitting in the Sukkot. And we pray for rain until the first day of Passover. Why the first day of Passover? Because in ancient times you would all go to Jerusalem and you don't want to be rained on along the way. And they're the most important prayers of the year, because in ancient times, if it didn't rain in the rainy season in Israel, there would be mass starvation. And at least one of my teachers, a scholar, speculates that the reason for Yom Kippur is Sukkot, namely to cleanse our souls of sin, so our prayers for rain will be answered, because the prayers for rain which begin in Sukkot are the most important prayers of the year. I'll probably talk about that next time. At the end of Sukkot, either the 8th day, Reform, 9th day, traditional, we have Simchat Torah, where we celebrate the giving of the Torah. No, not the giving of the Torah. We celebrate the Torah, and we start the cycle over again. And this is probably a couple of years ago. We have a community celebration here in Ventura County, where we have all the local rabbis come and do something, and then there's started a tradition in many communities. Some of you have probably seen this, of unrolling an entire Torah scroll, so you can see what's in a Torah scroll. And then the tradition is, in one breath, you finish reading the end of Deuteronomy and you begin the beginning of Genesis. We are, most of us, familiar with Hanukkah, although Hanukkah is not in the Bible. Hanukkah is strictly in the Talmud. I'll talk more about Hanukkah when we get into it. Of course, the major symbols of Hanukkah is the Chanukiah with 9 lights, 8 lights, 1 for each night, and a shamash to light the other lights. A tradition there's a tradition of eating oily foods, because Hanukkah is about the miracle of oil. I'm going to talk about that. And so in Israel, it's jelly donuts, deep fried donuts. In the Ashkenazi world, it is potato pancakes, both greasy and oily. And there is a simple game called dreidel that people play. I'll talk more about that. And giving small gifts. The Hebrew word for money is gelt. Maybe, no, it's probably a Yiddish word. Actually, I'm not sure if it's both. So the story is that 167 BCE, roughly, the Syrian Greek rulers who occupied the land sought to destroy Judaism. They failed. There was a revolt against Antiochus, led by the Maccabee family. It succeeded, and the temple, which had been horribly fouled, was cleansed. And in fact, some people speculate, I don't know, I haven't heard this recently, I need to ask one of my archaeology buddies, that the Western Wall tunnels, which some of you may have been in, were actually built to bring water to the Temple Mount, so it could be cleansed around the time of Hanukkah. And the word Hanukkah means dedication. So if you put a mezuzah on your house, technically that ceremony is called Chanukah Habayit, the dedication of your house. So what we're doing is we're celebrating once the revolt succeeded, the temple was cleansed, and they were sacrificing pigs to Zeus in the temple, and dumping garbage on the Temple Mount. So once they cleansed it, they rededicated the temple, and that's what we celebrate. We'll talk about the 8 nights of miracles, the oil lasting more than just one night. And I always like to point out, particularly in interfaith settings, that without Hanukkah, there would be no Christmas. I always ask people to repeat, I'll do it next time. Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas, but without Hanukkah, there would be no Christmas. Because had the Hanukkah revolt failed, roughly 200 years or so before the birth of Jesus, Judaism might have been extinguished before Jesus would ever have a chance to be born, and Christianity might not exist. And then I also point out that the church returns the favor, because the historical record of Hanukkah is preserved in the books of Maccabees, which for very interesting reasons we will discuss next time, the rabbis decided not to put in our Bible. But the Christian church never got the memo to keep those books out of the Bible. Therefore, they kept them in their Bible, in Catholic and Roman, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Old Testaments. So a lot of what we know about the Hanukkah revolt, we owe to the Christian church. And we'll talk about the candles and how you light them, and potato latkes and sufganiyot for the oil. The dreidels have the letters on there, Nun Gimel He Shen, for a Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there. And in Israel, you can buy dreidels that instead of a shin have a pei, which means a great miracle happened here. I'm going to add 2 more thoughts, and I'll call on you, Cheryl. Although Hanukkah is a minor holiday in Judaism, it's a major holiday in our lives because of the confluence with Christmas. So we want to have something for our kids too. But if you go to Arab lands, which is to say where Sephardim live, like Morocco, where my wife lived, grew up, Hanukkah is celebrated by lighting some candles and having some very small gifts. But it's not even a traditional gift-giving holiday. Purim is a traditional gift-giving holiday. Of course, Hanukkah has gone way out of proportion here. Having said that, the deeper meanings of Hanukkah that I always reflect upon is that you have enough. Hanukkah is a holiday which talks about not having enough oil, not having enough armies, not having enough resources to overcome problems. But with God's help and with faith, the Israelites had enough. And then also, Hanukkah is the rededication of a temple that was horribly fouled. The first temple had a dedication. The second temple had a dedication. We don't have holidays to commemorate that. We have a holiday that commemorates something that's horribly fouled, cleansed, and then rededicated. So Hanukkah is for me, a great spiritual symbol of how you can turn your life around, and what was awful and wrong and horrible can be cleansed and made pure again. And I always think of Hanukkah as having special significance when I talk to folks that are on chemotherapy, when I talk to people in recovery that are struggling to cleanse their lives. I think Hanukkah has very powerful significance. Cheryl.
How did it start that Hanukkah was associated, that it was really Sukkot? Okay,
I'm going to talk about that next time.
Okay.
Yes, and there's a connection between Hanukkah and Sukkot, and it's really, really interesting. So tune in. Okay, so next holiday, covering it quickly, is Purim, Book of Esther. And for every one of these holidays, we're going to talk about language of the holidays, namely the Hebrew and Yiddish names for these various things, and some deeper meanings. So just some of the things you see here are grogger, noisemakers. When we tell the story of Purim, we applaud the heroes, and we make noise to drown out the villains. It is a holiday of getting dressed up. It's the Jewish Halloween. There's a traditional cookie called Hamantaschen. I'll talk more about that. And there is the scroll of Esther, Megillat Esther, that we read. It is the story of Haman, Achashverosh, Mordechai and Esther, it's the story of a king who is laughably stupid. It's the story of lots and lots of drunken parties. It's the story of the king making obviously stupid decisions, listening to stupid advisors. Let me say ill-informed or advisors with poor judgment, and threatening the Jewish people who were doing quite well in Persia. The name Purim refers to the Persian word for drawing lots, because the bad guy Haman draws lots to decide which day that they will kill all the Jews. The deeper meaning of Purim is no matter how good you have it in a diaspora, even in a world such as the world in the story where a Jew can become queen, at the whim of a government official, all Jews can face death. We are never safe in the diaspora. I think, I don't know if it was President Obama or, I can't remember which president it was, but when there was real concern about Iran, still concern about Iran getting nuclear weapons, when Prime Minister Netanyahu visited the White House, he gave the president a scroll of Esther, just pointing out that we had problems in Iran before, and we could have problems again. And the other lesson, which we'll talk about, is Esther and Mordechai, the heroes of the story, were absolutely assimilated Jews. In fact, their names are very Goyish. Their names are after Babylonian god and goddess. And also another lesson is whoever would be God must destroy the Jews totally. So any ruler, when they want to get absolute power in history, they go after the Jews. Moving right along, we have Passover, probably the most observed of Jewish holidays. And there is a traditional Passover plate with symbolic foods, and we will talk about that. There's the Haggadah, the prayer book for telling the story. It's an 8-day holiday commemorating the Exodus, 7 days in Israel. And in Reform, 8 days in Jewish tradition because of that uncertainty of when the month begins. There are lots of laws. You must eat matzah and you can't eat chametz. Those are actually two separate laws. The Haggadah is read, and one of the fascinating things about a traditional Haggadah is Moses is not mentioned in the Haggadah. Imagine trying to tell the story of the Exodus without mentioning Moses. Why is Moses not mentioned? I think there was, scholars would say, there was a concern that Moses, the leading prophet, would be worshipped as a god. And people speculate that also may be the reason why his grave site is not marked or known in Jewish tradition. Because there was a fear at the time of the rabbis that a great prophet, a great leader would be worshipped as God. As you know, this happened in Christianity. So there's some subtle things going on there. About 90% of Jews attend the Seder. The word Seder means order. That, when I was growing up, that was the only Jewish thing we did, other than the fact that my older brother and I had to go to Hebrew school and become bar mitzvah. We, I would say, observed nothing else traditionally in the Jewish calendar. And the deeper meaning here is that you should live as though you were personally freed from Egypt. And you should also examine your life to see what you are a slave to, what things dominate your own life. Shavuot is the holiday where we commemorate the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. And again, I'll talk about it in more detail. This is sort of a picture. Well, it's a rendition. Here's the tabernacle with the cloud of fire during the daytime, and the tribes camped around Sinai and receiving of the law. It's an amazing time to be in Israel. I've led a couple of trips to Israel during Shavuot, and you see the sea of white talesim. This is the men's side wearing talit. You can just about see the division of the women's side. Women are not wearing talits. The word Shavuot means weeks. The Hebrew word Shavuah means week, plural Shavuot. We count a week of weeks, namely 49 days from Passover, the second night of Passover, to Shavuot. And there's a tradition of counting the Omer. I'll talk about that more next time. It celebrates the receiving of Torah at Sinai. And as I say again all the time, every time in the Bible, when Moses goes to Pharaoh to quote God to say, "Let my people go," every one of those references in Exodus, Moses adds the reason for liberation. The reason for liberation is not freedom qua freedom. It's so we can leave the service of Pharaoh and begin serving God. And I'll talk more about that. So we connect Passover to Shavuot. The reason we're leaving Egypt is to go to Sinai to get the law, so we can stop being servants of Pharaoh and become servants of God. Also, of course, the giving of the Torah is quite detailed, a quite detailed exposition of law and other fun stories. And the amazing thing here, which I think is really an innovation in human history, is the understanding of a God with whom we are in covenant. Namely, God is not simply a supernatural Pharaoh that can do whatever God wants. God enters into a relationship with humanity and with the Jews specifically here, and God is bound to Jewish law and bound to the idea of justice and righteousness. Our job is to follow God. God's job is to be our God and live up to the terms of the covenant. There's lots of interesting discussions of this, but it's an innovative idea, the idea of covenant in Hebrew Brit, Ashkenazi Hebrew bris, and it's also a harvest holiday. The traditional reading in synagogues for Shavuot is the book of Ruth. I should have said the traditional reading for Passover is Song of Songs. The traditional reading for Shavuot is the book of Ruth, because there are themes of faith and harvest. And there is also a tradition of staying up late at night or all night long studying Torah or studying texts the night before Shavuot. Holidays don't stop with the closing of Bible and the closing of Talmud. There are modern holidays. So we have days commemorating the Holocaust, which clearly, is only 70 something, 80 something years old. I don't know when it actually began. There's Israeli Independence Day, which I do know is 73 years old. Memorial Day, the day before Independence Day, and then the Independence Day. And I love this quote by Ben Gurion, that if you don't believe in miracles in Israel, you are not a realist. You can't explain Israel's history without resorting to miracles, says Ben Gurion. The one thing I just want to point out about the cycle of holidays, if you've ever been in Israel on Yom HaZikaron, it's Memorial Day. But every family in Israel has been touched by deaths in Israel's wars. There's a lot of Israel's wars. There are no families that have escaped losing, sons, fathers, brothers, and so on. So Memorial Day in Israel is not a day of big sales and picnics and having fun. It's a day of minor mourning. The fascinating thing is, of course, Yom HaZikaron ends at sunset, and Independence Day begins at sunset. So you have this shocking, I can only call it a shocking transition at sunset, where you go from mourning to celebration. But that also is very evocative of the Jewish experience of going from mourning to celebration rapidly. Okay, I want to spend the rest of the time we have on Shabbat. Symbols of Shabbat, of course, lighting Sabbath candles, wine, which we use as a way of blessing the day. Technically, we're not blessing the wine, we're actually blessing the day using the wine. And then a challah, which is also reminiscent of the breads that were in the temple. One of the themes going on, broadly speaking, is that after the destruction of the temple, there is no more temple, there is no more priesthood serving God at the temple. Our homes become mini temples. It's called Mikdash Me'at. And we do things that were in the temple, we do them in our homes. And one is having these breads, celebratory breads. And there were 12 of them in the temple. In some traditions, there are 12 braids in the challah. I don't know if that is always a tradition. We wash our hands ritually before eating, in the same way that the priests would wash their hands before conducting the sacrificial system in the temple. So that's one of the themes that's going on that's easy to miss if nobody points it out to you. So overview, one of my favorite quotes on the Sabbath is this one, that more than Israel has kept the Sabbath has kept Israel. Observing the Sabbath is a tradition in Judaism, which certainly has had a significant role in keeping Jewish families staying Jewish. Of all of creation, only one element, in fact, only one thing in the opening of the Bible is called holy, and it's time, it's the Sabbath. There's no holy places. We get the temple much later. The only thing that's holy in Genesis is the Sabbath. It's the first thing in the Torah that's called holy, and the only thing in the Ten Commandments that's called holy. The Sabbath is the only thing in the creation story that's wholly new to the world. And this is, again, sort of along the same theme that Bryce introduced. There is nothing connected to the universe that is particularly connected to a time of 7 days. As Bryce has pointed out, in ancient times, there were 7 heavenly bodies, and that may be the origin of why 7 became such an important number in Jewish tradition. But the idea of dividing time into 7 days is wholly new, although some scholars believe that it may have been introduced by the Babylonians, but certainly picked up in a major way by the Israelites. I would say in all the movements, Jews agree. With all the movements agree. What Jews agree on is probably a contradiction in terms. That the Sabbath is a time for spiritual refreshment. We should do something to reflect the holiness of the day. There's a wide variation on what should be done. It's a reminder not to let the need to make a living make us blind to the need for living. And there are some beautiful quotes. I'm going to have some from Abraham Joshua Heschel along these lines. I will start to try and give you suggested reading assignments both in my book and in the handbook. But you will find, if you search particularly through the handbook, things are kind of spread out through the book. They actually combine 3 separate handbooks into one volume. So it's a day in which we've achieved the redemption of the world. If you look on page 120 of the handbook, you will see the specific labors that are prohibited according to the Mishnah and the Talmud. We don't do any work because there's nothing to do. This I kind of like. This is an insight I learned from the book by Greenberg, the Jewish Way. What he says there is in Talmudic tradition, the Sabbath is a taste of the world redeemed. It's actually described as 1/60th of the world redeemed. There's a beautiful passage which says that sleep is 1/60th of death, dreaming is 1/60th of prophecy, and the Sabbath is 1/60th of the world redeemed. Why 1/60th? Because the Babylonian number system was based on the number 60. We still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. So it's the equivalent of the rabbi saying 1%. It's a taste of the world redeemed. So on the Sabbath, what's going on a deeper spiritual level is we are pretending that the Messiah has come and that the world is perfect. And there is nothing that we need to do to make the world any better. We're charged as Jews, as humans, with making the world a better place. On the Sabbath, we're going to pretend for 24 hours that we've done it. The world is perfect. So why don't you go shopping on the Sabbath? Because there's nothing on your purchase list. You have everything you need. Why don't you work? Because there's nothing to do. Why don't you carry money or conduct business or do anything like that? There is literally nothing to do. We're pretending the Messiah has come, the world is redeemed, and now, it'd be an interesting question of what would you do in such a world? How will you spend your time in the world redeemed? In Judaism, it means we'll eat wonderful meals. So historically, people that might be starving during the week would save food for a wonderful Friday night meal. We would get the best dishes out. We would make love with our spouses. We would study Torah. We would spend the day in prayer. Impossible to imagine a life better than that from a Jewish perspective. Then Saturday night comes, and it's clear the Messiah has not yet come. So we beg for the Messiah's coming. So we sing a song about Elijah, because the tradition is Eliyahu Hanavi will come in Mashiach ben David, with the Messiah, the son of David. So we're saddened because the Messiah has not come, and now it's time to get back to work. So just moving down some of these thoughts, the Sabbath is viewed as a bride. The Lechadodi is a poem which describes the anticipation of the mystics in the mystical city in Israel of Safed, as anticipating the Sabbath with as much anticipation as a bridegroom would anticipate the arrival of his bride on their wedding night. We don't do anything that affects creation because creation is complete. It's as though we pause in our painting. If you imagine this from an artistic metaphor, we pause in our painting to take a step back and look at our painting for a period of time. We dress in our best clothes, sing songs, relax with family, study Torah. We try to help unify God's male and female aspects in heaven by unifying our male and female, traditionally, aspects on earth. That's why sex is a double mitzvah on Friday night. There's a tradition that you have an extra Sabbath soul on the Sabbath. When that soul returns to heaven on Saturday night, God asks the soul, what have you learned? How did you celebrate Shabbat? And sad is the soul that has to report to God that, my host went to work on Shabbat and I didn't do anything. And happy is the soul that can report a beautiful Shabbat. Just some other thoughts. Ethics is the way to serve God. Ritual is the way to connect with God. Shabbat combines the two. One of the reasons, there are a couple of reasons for gefilte fish. One of the reasons is a sign of a truly rich meal would be one that would have a fish course and a meat course. But of course, through much of Jewish history, Jews couldn't afford to have a very nice fish course and a meat course. So gefilte fish is made from fish scraps. And the other is you're not allowed to separate bones on Shabbat. That's a prohibited form of work. And with gefilte fish, you don't have to worry about that. And Haddalah, we'll talk about, is the ceremony when we go back to the work week. There's material in our handbook about preparing for Shabbat, setting tables, giving to tzedakah, starting with candle lighting, 2 candles for the 2 words in the commandment to observe the Shabbat is part of the 10 commandments. In Exodus, the reason for the Sabbath is given as the commemoration of God resting on the 7th day of creation. In Deuteronomy, the reason is given as we're told to guard the Sabbath in commemorating the leaving of Egypt. We'll talk about how I don't know if we'll talk about it, but it certainly is in the handbook. You light the candles first, and then you say the blessing. It's a tradition to bless your family, to make a blessing for the Sabbath over the wine. You say a blessing for the bread over the challah. There's a wonderful tradition of covering the challah. You probably have seen this. You cover the challah while you're saying the blessing over the wine. Everybody familiar with this? So the tradition that it was explained to me, it's just a great story that I really like, is that normally if you have a meal, the first thing you do in a meal is have a piece of bread and say the motzi. because the blessing over the bread covers every other dish. You know, if I have a glass of water, I would say a blessing over water, which would be Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'hakol nihiyeh bidvoro, that everything was made by God's word. Blessing over, you know, a piece of fruit from a tree would be Borei Pri Ha'etz, and so on. If you have bread and say that blessing, it covers everything except wine. Wine gets its own blessing. So for a normal meal, first thing that gets blessed is the bread. Then if you happen to have wine during the meal, you say a blessing over the wine. Everybody with me? On Shabbat, we say a blessing over the wine first, because we're actually blessing the day. So now we're concerned about the feelings of the challah, because the challah is hearing the blessing over the wine, and it's wondering what happened to my blessing. So we cover the challah, because it is a known principle of physics that challah cannot hear through cloth. I don't know if you know this. So the challah is not jealous of the blessing over the wine. There is a great story about this, which I probably should wait till the discussion of. No, I think this is the only discussion of Shabbat. So there's a great Hasidic story about this, that the rabbi of the town is invited to dinner by the wealthiest guy in town. And he arrives for dinner, and for Friday night, for Erev Shabbat dinner. And he arrives for dinner, and he's greeted, you know, customarily, they tell me, the way rabbis would be greeted on Erev Shabbat, with great honor and distinction. And the rich man is trying to show more and more honor to the rabbi, so he's apologizing for everything. Rabbi, I'm sorry, the house really isn't, you know, perfectly cleaned and in a perfect state like that you should have. And I'm sorry the table, you know, isn't quite perfectly set. And, you know, the dishes are not quite lined up. And I'm sorry about this and I'm sorry about that. And they start to sit down for dinner, and the rabbi says, I'm sorry, I can't eat here. And the rich man is shocked. He says, why can't you eat here? And he says, because this is not a kosher home. Well, the rich guy is now about to tear into his wife because she's probably committed some kind of ritual violation that has offended the rabbi. And the rabbi said, no, you don't understand. If we care so much about the feelings of challah that we make a special effort to cover it when we say the blessing over the wine, how much more so should we care about the feelings of people? And the way you've shown a lack of caring for your wife's feelings convinced me that this is not a kosher home and I can't eat here. So I love that story. And then, of course, we eat the meal and we say a blessing after the meal. There's a few differences in a blessing after Shabbat than a blessing in a normal meal. Moving right along with Shabbat, the Friday night is traditionally in the Orthodox world a very short service on a Friday night. And typically what happens is the women are home preparing the home for a Shabbat dinner. The men go to a short service beginning at sunset in the synagogue. The women light the candles at home at sunset. That's traditional. These days in conservative and reform practice, Friday night is often the major Shabbat celebration. And in fact, in many small synagogues, unless there's a bar bat mitzvah, there is not a Saturday morning celebration. So the only Sabbath celebration is Friday night. When that's true, you know, you may find Torah readings on Friday night. Traditionally, Torah is read on Saturday mornings. And then also there are actually two services in traditional Judaism and conservative Judaism for that matter. Actually, there's three services every day, and a fourth service on Shabbat. So you have morning service, Shacharit, you have afternoon service, Mincha, and you have evening service, Ma'ariv. On Shabbat, you have a Torah reading in the morning and in the afternoon. And then there's also an additional service called Musaf. You don't have to worry about this. None of this is going to be on the test. And by the way, there is no test. I usually say that, and then I get panic letters from emails from people saying, wait, this is going to be a test. No test. After services on Friday night, we have an oneg. The Hebrew word oneg means joy. so the Sabbath joy is things like Regalach and kugel, not kugel, but anyway, just tasty stuff, desserts. Page 27, 427, sorry, in the workbook for ideas about Sabbath observance from traditional to reform. And I would say the key is to make the day different or unique. You know, for many people I know in the reform world, a day of going to a park or camping or listening to music is the way they make the day unique. They may be violating strict Orthodox law by getting in their car and going to a park or listening to music. But so I would say be flexible in how you observe the Sabbath, but mark it and observe it some way. You decide, particularly in Reform Judaism, for ritual laws, you decide which laws God wants you to obey. What's your relationship with God? And that can evolve and change over time. And don't adopt an all or nothing approach. You know, don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Start doing something. Havdalah is the end of the Sabbath. We start the Sabbath by lighting candles. We end the Sabbath by extinguishing a candle. We have blessings for wine and spices. We pretty much use wine for everything in Judaism. Spices, we try and hold on to the sweetness of the Sabbath spirit. And we talk about, and at the end of the service, we extinguish the Havdalah candle, which is a multi-wicked candle in the wine, celebrating the beginning of the work week. And the spiritual thing I ever saw at Havdalah was I went to a Havdalah at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And there are all, you know, well, men's side and women's side. On the men's side, all the blessings are being said, and the Havdalah candle is being held aloft and lit. But before the Havdalah candle is extinguished, it's passed around and everybody is lighting their cigarettes from the Havdalah candle because they haven't been able to smoke for 24 hours. And for those of you who are, you know, smokers, you know that that's a pretty significant trial. But didn't look very spiritual to me. Wonderful quotes from Heschel. I'll just read them. There is a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord. There is happiness in the love of labor, and there is misery in the love of gain. The higher goal of spiritual living is not to amass wealth, a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. Judaism is a religion of time aimed at sanctification of time. The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath, we try to become attuned to holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. 6 days a week, we seek to dominate the world. On the seventh day, we try to dominate the self. Just as creation began with the word, "Let there be light," so does the celebration of creation begin with the kindling of lights. We share time, we own space. Through my ownership of space, I am a rival of all other beings. Through my living in time, I am a contemporary of all other beings. Time is God's gift to the world of space. Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote this amazing book called The Sabbath. It is by far the most readable of his books. He is an astounding scholar. When you read his other books, and he's written a lot of other books, you read a page or two or three, and then you have to just sit down and try and digest it. This book is very powerful, but it's also very readable, so I recommend it to you. So my bottom line on Shabbat, don't let the best be the enemy of the good.
Yes.
Start observing the Sabbath in some way and let your soul be your guide. And my old questions and answers slide, so I'm going to stop sharing and just ask if anybody has any questions or comments. And we'll do a little bit of this and then we'll continue more informally after the recording's done. Judy.
Why on the Havdalah candle do they look at their fingers like that?
Yeah, I can't hear you. You need to get closer to wherever the microphone is.
Why, when they're using the Havdalah candle, they move their fingers and look at them, and what does that mean?
On the Havdalah candle, where you hold it like over your fingernails and
Yes.
stuff? Okay, so the question was, it was a little hard to hear her, for me anyway. The question was, why do we have this custom when we hold up the Havdalah candle of putting it in front of your fingers, casting a shadow with it? The mystics believed that the fingernails were a window into the body and into the soul. So the reason for holding a Havdalah candle to your fingernails is to let the light of the Havdalah penetrate into your soul. I don't know if that answered all your question. I couldn't quite hear if there's more.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other great question? The really obscure question is why are there multiple wicks in a Havdalah candle? And the reason for that is simpler than you think. When the rabbis minted the blessings that you say, and all the Baruch Atah Adonais, the rabbis wrote in the Talmud, here's what you say. You have water, you say this. You have wine, you say that. For the Havdalah candle, the end of the blessing is Borei Meorei Ha'esh, which is who created the lights of fire. And lights is in the plural. So the rabbi said you have to have more than one wick. Technically, you could just hold two Shabbat candles together, but that's why there are multiple wicks. That's probably the most obscure bit of Jewish trivia I can think of at the moment. I'm sure I'll come up with something else too. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to end the recording.